Hey guys, Chris here with theGoodOldGamer. So today we're finally going to be taking a look at the Ryzen 3600X. So I want to start this video off by saying the numbers, while objective and are accurate, they don't tell the whole story. So towards the end of the video, I'm going to give you my thoughts and feelings on actually using the Ryzen 3600X in comparison to the other Ryzen CPUs, because there is a pretty big difference there, and I'll explain that more here in a little bit. So before we jump in, let's go ahead and talk about the test system. So starting off, I tested the 3600X against its littler brothers, or older brothers, I guess you could say, with the 1600X and 2600X respectively. Now, I know a lot of you guys are wondering about boost clocks. The 3600X boosted all the way up to the 4.4 gigahertz under single thread applications. During actual typical gaming scenarios, it usually was between 4.2 and 4.3 gigahertz depending on what game I was playing. Now, for comparison, the 2600X typically in gaming scenarios comes in between 4 gigahertz and 4.1 gigahertz, and the 1600X pretty much locks itself down to 3.7 gigahertz under any sort of workload past single thread. Now, if you guys saw my previous video, you know that I was having some issues getting the 3600X working on my Gigabyte X470 Aorus Ultimate Gaming motherboard. Now, it wasn't so much that it wasn't working, it just takes a really long time for these 3000 series CPUs to basically configure themselves. So if you are upgrading, give your system plenty of time to reboot. It'll power cycle a bunch of times until it kicks on. Unless it's throwing a beep code or an error code at you, just let it keep doing its thing until it's figured it out. That was the issue. I also used my ASRock AB350M Pro 4 motherboard. That one also had to power cycle a few times, but that one came up a lot quicker. So the 3600X was actually tested on that motherboard, and I went ahead and checked the numbers against the X470. I'm just gonna let you guys know there was no difference in performance. Everything was within margin of error. Sometimes the X470 would score higher, sometimes the AB450 would, or 350 would score higher. So there's no difference there. Now, as far as the games, I chose a balanced number of games. I didn't want to test like 1,000 different games. Instead, I went for a more balanced approach. 3 games are NVIDIA-sponsored titles, 3 AMD-sponsored titles, and then 3 games that are not affiliated with either of those guys. Now, certain game engines do run better on AMD versus NVIDIA and vice versa. That I wasn't taking into account. I wanted to have 3 sponsored games from each, and then 3 neutral games, and that's the way that I decided to do my testing. So alrighty guys, with that out of the way, let's check out those benchmarks. Alright, so kicking the benchmarks off with Cinebench R15, we can see the new 3600X is a good deal ahead of the 2600X, going from 1352 points up to 1623. And we see that the jump from the 2nd to 3rd gen is much higher than 1st to 2nd on this test. We can see a pretty linear progression when it comes to the single thread performance, starting at 161 with the 1600X, up to 173 with the 2600X, and then 203 for the single core performance on the 3600X. Next up, with Cinebench R20, we see a pretty similar result. The 3600X is a good bit ahead of the 2600X, going from 3032 all the way up to 3696 on multi-thread, and then on single core, starting with the 1600X, we started at 395, then up to 423 with the 2600X, and then finally landing over 500 at 505 with the 3600X. And for the last of our non-gaming benchmarks, I decided to use Blender. This is the same Blender test that I used for my IPC testing. And we can see here, starting with the 1600X, came in at 33.9 seconds, compared to the 2600X at 31.7 seconds, and the 3600X coming in at 27.8. So that's another pretty significant jump in the productivity workloads. So with that out of the way, time to get into the gaming benchmarks, and we're going to kick that off with Battlefield 1. I do not own Battlefield 5, but this is the exact same game engine, Frostbite 3, and it has most of the same features. Now on the average frame rate, we can see actually a pretty good uptick in this particular game, starting with the 1600X at 119 frames per second, going to 133 on the 2600X, and then up to 162 with the 3600X. So that's a pretty good jump, almost a 30 FPS average increase. Taking a look at the 1% and 0.1% lows, we don't see much of a difference between the 1600X and the 2600X. We actually saw an average regression on the 1% low, but that's because this is a variable test, so there are going to be some instances where that happens, but the 0.1% lows are virtually the same at about 74 and 73 respectively. We can see that the 3600X is actually a pretty good bit higher here, coming in at 100 frames per second on the 1% low and 93 frames per second on the 0.1% low. This is a significant jump over the previous Ryzen CPUs. Now on to the Division 2. Right here, we don't see too much of a difference on the average frame rate between the three CPUs. This is because even at 720p with a GTX 1070, we're still GPU bottlenecked overall. However, looking at the 1% low and 0.1% low on the 1600X, we can see we started at 70 on the 1% low and 50 frames per second on the 0.1% low. This jumped up a lot with the 2nd gen Ryzen up to 79 frames per second and 68 frames per second respectively. And then with the 3rd gen Ryzen, we see another increase up to 85 frames per second and 73 on the 0.1% low. So in this title, even at 720p, a GTX 1070 is not powerful enough to really push either the 2nd gen or 3rd gen Ryzen CPUs. We see a pretty similar result over here with Doom, with all three CPUs at the 200 frame per second cap. Now, on the 1% and 0.1% lows, we don't see really any difference between the 1st and 2nd gen Ryzens again. And then on the 3rd gen, we do see a decent uplift on the 1% low, going from 141 and 145 up to 156. And then the 0.1% low going from 117 up to 124. So there is a little bit of an increase, but once again, we are GPU limited even at 720p in Doom. Now we're starting to get somewhere. With Far Cry 5, we see a pretty big, or a pretty linear increase here. So starting off, we can see that the 3600X at 114 frames per second is miles ahead of the 2600X at only 91, and the 1600X back at 85. The 1% lows, we can see the 1600X starting off at 64 frames per second. With 2nd gen, that jumped up to 70, and then with the 3rd gen Ryzen, that jumps all the way up to 84 frames per second. Going back to the 1600X on the 0.1% low, we had 57, then we jumped up to 63 with the 2nd gen Ryzen, and then with the brand new Zen 2 architecture, that jumps all the way up to 75 frames per second. So we see a pretty significant jump across the board on Far Cry 5. Now, to represent Unreal Engine 4, I decided to use Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice. And much like what we just saw in Far Cry 5, we see pretty good increased scaling from 1st gen to 2nd gen, and then a massive increase up to the brand new 3rd gen Ryzen CPUs. So since the 1st gen and 2nd gen are pretty close, we're just going to take a look at 2nd gen to 3rd gen, where we have an average frame rate of 125 frames per second on the 2600X, all the way up to 157 frames per second on the 3600X. And then on the 1% low, going from 102 all the way up to 130, that's a pretty good jump there. And then on the 0.1% low, going from 44 frames per second up to 54 frames per second. So once again, another very strong showing from the brand new Ryzen 3000 series. Okay, so next on the list, we have Metro Exodus. And here, once again, we can see the 1st and 2nd gen Ryzen CPUs are within a few percentage points of each other. So we'll just be comparing the 2600X to the 3600X. And the 2600X came in with a 105 FPS average and 107 on the 3600X. So once again, we are GPU limited even at 720p. However, on the 1% low, we go from 71 frames per second up to 81 frames per second. And then the 0.1% lows go from 22 frames per second up to 29 frames per second. Now, that doesn't sound that impressive, but believe me, overall, that is a mighty impressive increase. Rage 2, yet another title that were apparently GPU bound even at 720p. However, there is one massively interesting result in this particular benchmark. Now, all the CPUs are between 136 frames per second and 139 on average, so nothing special there, and between 114 and 116 on the 1% low. nothing really special there. However, the 0.1% low on the 1600X came in at 44 frames per second, the 2600X at 52 frames per second, and the 3600X jumped that all the way up to 107 frames per second, more than doubling the 0.1% low performance here on Rage 2. And trust me, I'm going to go over that in the conclusion here, but that makes a world of difference. Now, Resident Evil 2 is another game that is rather GPU limited. We do see a little increase on the average frame rate going each generation, starting at 178 up to 181, and then finally at 185 with the 3600X. However, it's the 0.1% and 1% lows that are more impressive. The first and second gen Ryzen on the 1% lows and 0.1% lows are relatively similar. However, checking out the third gen Ryzen, we go from 126 or 128 frames per second on the 1% low, all the way up to 148, and then going from 85 frames per second all the way up to 114 on the 0.1% low. So another good showing for the brand new Ryzen CPUs. And with the final game test, we'll take a look at Shadow of the Tomb Raider. Now this one is pretty impressive across the board, and we see good scaling from each generation. Okay, so going from the 1600X to the 2600X, we go from 77 to 82 frames per second on average, and then that goes all the way up to 95 frames per second with the 3600X. Starting with the 1600X on the 1% low, we have 45 frames per second. That goes to 51 with the second generation Ryzen, so that's a pretty good increase there. And then that jumps all the way up to 62 frames per second on the third gen Ryzen CPUs. Now, unlike a couple of the other tests, the 0.1% lows are pretty consistent here. We start at 28 frames per second on the 1600X, and then the 2600X and 3600X both came in at 31 frames per second. All right, so averaging all those game tests up, these are the numbers that we got here. And we can see the 1600X came in with an average of 125 frames per second on average, and then 130 for the 2600X. That jumps up to 142 frames per second with the 3600X. Now you have to remember, on average, a lot of these games were GPU bound, so there's more room there. However, this is all we could get with a GTX 1070 at 720p. The more interesting numbers are the 1% and 0.1% low, which start off at the 1600X at 89 for the 1% low, going up to 93 on the 2600X. That jumps all the way up to 107 with the 3600X. Now, the 0.1% lows start off at 57 frames per second with the 1600X, go up a little bit to 62 frames per second with the 2600X, and then jump all the way up to 78 frames per second on the 3600X. Now, to make sense of all that data, compared to the first-gen Ryzen, on average, the 3600X was 14% faster. But once again, like I noted, we were GPU limited in a lot of tests. Now, we saw a 20% increase on the 1% low performance, and a massive 37% increase on the 0.1% low. So that is huge. Compared to second-gen Ryzen, we only saw a 9% gain on average, a 15% gain on the 1% low, which actually matches AMD's IPC very nicely, and then we still saw a 26% gain on the 0.1% low. Well, alrighty guys, there we go. We have objective data showing that the 0.1% lows are massively increased on the new Zen 2 architecture. Now, the subjective truth to all of this, so the way that it actually feels playing these games with the Ryzen 3000 is much better. It's almost like a whole nother level of gaming. Those micro stutters that you didn't even notice, because they're not like apparent while you're actually playing, are gone. The smoothness level of the gameplay is just on a whole nother level compared to the Ryzen 1 and Zen Plus architectures. Those still run fine, and as you saw from the numbers, they still produce really, really good gaming experiences. Now, we've seen the market really shift towards the lower end, the 1% and 0.1% lows. There's a reason for that, because that's going to determine whether or not you have a great experience or not. The maximum frame rate and high frame rates, they don't matter near as much as the bottom. If you're hitting 400 frames per second on average, but your 0.1% low is at, let's say, like 100 or 50 frames per second, that is not a good gaming experience. And with this CPU, especially on something like Rage 2, it literally felt like a different game. Now, this is just my subjective opinion, but doubling or more than doubling that 0.1% low just delivered a whole new level of experience. Now, the really nice thing about the Ryzen 3600 and 3600X, they're very, very affordable, starting at $199 and $249 respectively. You really can't go wrong. As a gamer, these are the CPUs that gamers should be looking at. Sure, you can look at, the 8-core, 16 threads, and 12-core, 24-thread CPUs, but for gaming, they don't really make any sense. These CPUs are really going to deliver all of that punch that you need to play all of today's latest games, and you can upgrade in the future. That's the beautiful part about the AM4 platform. In the future, if you do need a higher core count CPU, you can get them at that point at a much lower price. For gamers, the 3600 and 3600X absolutely makes the most sense at those particular price points. Now, the reason why I went with the 3600X is because I had a 1600X and a 2600X. In reality, I would recommend going with the 3600 non-X because we're only going to be getting about 200 megahertz faster. So overall performance is probably only going to be within single-digit percentage points. I mean, you're probably only looking at 2 to 3% faster for $50 more, which is a 25% price increase. Honestly, that part is not worth it to me. However, the other side is you do get the Wraith Spire cooler with the 3600X versus a Wraith Stealth cooler with the 3600. So you also do get a better cooler with this CPU. So if you want to save as much money as possible and not buy another cooler, you can still use the Wraith Stealth, but the Wraith Spire that comes with the 3600X is a much better cooler, and you can get those extra clock speeds. You don't have to worry about overclocking. This thing does it all out of the box. You just throw it in, let your motherboard boot a bunch of times, and then you're done. And after that, everything works fine. I've had no issues with it. And honestly, overall, I'd probably go with the 3600 over the X, but both CPUs are great options for you guys. Well, alrighty guys, those are my thoughts. Let me know what you guys think down in the comment section below. If you want to get your hands on the benchmarks, the slides that I used, you can head over to Patreon. They're free for everybody. You can check them out over there. And I want to thank all my patrons for helping me get this CPU on hand so we can do this video right here. Now, once again, I want to hear your guys' thoughts. I'm super excited to test this out with the RX 5700 that Tech is sending in. I should get it tomorrow or the next day. So many more videos coming up here, guys. Lots of testing. I'm having a lot of fun doing this. But once again, I want to thank you all for your support. And if you like this video, please hit that like button. Please subscribe. Please share with friends. That really does help me out. That's all I have for today. And I will catch you guys in the next video.